April 12, 1945, a clear spring morning in the heart of Germany. If you had stood at the edge of Weimar's cobblestone streets that day, you would have seen something that made no sense at first glance. A procession, hundreds of civilians moving in a slow, reluctant column along a quiet country road. Men in pressed suits and leather shoes, women in wool coats, handbags tucked under their arms, hair set carefully beneath their hats. They might have been walking to a lecture or a Sunday service, or perhaps a cultural gathering in the hills. Some murmured to each other in low voices. Some scowled at the inconvenience. A few gazed at the tree line with the mild detachment of people who had somewhere better to be. These were not ordinary citizens. These were the educated class of Weimar, professors, physicians, lawyers, city officials. The intellectual backbone of one of the most celebrated cities in the German world, the city of Goethe, the city of Schiller, a place that had long considered itself the conscience of civilization. But no one had asked them if they wanted to take this walk. On both sides of the column walked American soldiers, uniforms worn gray from weeks at the front, rifles carried not for ceremony but for purpose. Their faces did not carry the expression of escorts. They carried the expression of men who had already seen what was at the end of this road, and had decided that these people would see it too. The civilians had been told they were going for a walk. 5 miles, up through the wooded slopes of the Ettersberg Hill, to a place they swore, with remarkable consistency, they knew absolutely nothing about, a place that had stood on that hillside for 8 years. By the time the gates came into view, the smell alone would end the debate. This is the story of what happened when a city that prided itself on civilization was marched to the edge of its own conscience and forced to look down. But to understand why that morning shattered so many lives, you first have to understand the world those civilians had built for themselves. Before we begin, please don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. For generations, it had been held up as proof of what Germany could be at its finest, a city of poets and philosophers, of concert halls and candlelit debates, of citizens who measured themselves not by power, but by culture. They had Goethe's house, they had Schiller's legacy, they had, they believed, a particular kind of conscience, which made what they said on that road all the more remarkable. We didn't know. The whisper moved through the column like a current, murmured first, then repeated, then hardened into something that began to sound almost like conviction. Professors said it to the soldiers beside them. Officials said it to each other. Women in good coats said it quietly, eyes fixed on the road ahead. We didn't know. It's impossible. Not here. Not in our city. The American soldiers listened. Some were confused by it. Some were not, because the evidence had never been hidden. Not truly. The trains came through regularly. Long, slow transports moving through the outskirts of the city, the cars sealed, the sounds inside them not the sounds of cargo. People on platforms had looked away. Some had looked, noted what they suspected, and continued on to work. The tracks ran close enough to the road that a child cycling to school could have counted the cars. The guards were not ghosts. They wore their uniforms into town. They collected bread from the same bakeries, drank in the same taverns, sent their children to the same schools. Their wives attended performances at the National Theatre. Their names appeared in parish records. They were neighbors in the plainest sense of the word. And the smoke. On certain mornings, depending on the wind, it drifted down from the Ettersberg Hill and settled over the streets with a smell that was not wood, not coal, not anything the city wished to name. People closed their windows. They developed a habit of not remarking on it. This was not ignorance. It was architecture, a careful, collective construction of not knowing built brick by brick over 8 years, mortared with fear, and held together by the understanding that some questions, once asked aloud, could not be unasked. Fear played its part. To speak was dangerous. To notice was dangerous. The machinery of the regime had made curiosity a risk that most people quietly decided was not worth taking. Propaganda had done the rest, softening the edges, reclassifying the prisoners, building a language around the camp that kept it abstract, administrative, somewhere between bureaucracy and rumor. Small cruelties had been normalized so gradually that the larger ones became somehow imaginable, then invisible. The soldiers watched the civilians whisper their denials and said very little in return. They already knew what was waiting at the top of the hill, and soon, so would everyone else. By the time he arrived at Buchenwald in April 1945, he had spent years moving through the wreckage of the war's worst moments. He had walked battlefields where the dead lay in their thousands. He had seen what artillery did to men, what deprivation did to armies, what months of combat did to the human face. He had liberated Ohrdruf weeks earlier, a sub-camp so brutal that even hardened veterans had turned away. Patton had not turned away. He had looked. He had made others look. And he had believed, in the grim calculus of a soldier's experience, that he was prepared for whatever came next. Buchenwald changed that calculation. The scale was different. The evidence was not of battlefield violence, chaotic, frenzied, at least comprehensible within the logic of war. This was methodical, organized. It bore the unmistakable signature of a system that had been designed, maintained, and administered over years, in peacetime and wartime, alike, without interruption. The skeletal survivors, the stacked dead, the crematoriums with their careful industrial efficiency. Patton later wrote that he was physically ill. That was not a figure of speech. He stood on the hill and looked toward Weimar. The city was visible from the camp's perimeter, rooftops, a church spire, the ordinary geometry of civilian life continuing in the distance. 5 miles, a Sunday afternoon's walk, and in that moment something shifted in his thinking that moved beyond the conventions of military command. Every order he had ever given had been directed at soldiers, at officers, at the machinery of the enemy's armed forces. Accountability, in war, had a shape he understood. Perpetrators were identified, crimes were documented, tribunals would follow. But Buchenwald raised a different question, one that no military doctrine had prepared him to answer. What about the city on the hill? His order was not long. It did not require extensive justification. The citizens of Weimar, and specifically its educated, influential, and prominent citizens, were to be brought to the camp. They were to walk the grounds. They were to see everything. Nothing was to be removed, covered, or explained away on their behalf. The soldiers tasked with organizing the march carried it out with the quiet efficiency of men who understood, without being told, why it was necessary. Trucks moved through the streets. Names were collected. Doors were knocked on. The civilians who answered those doors did not refuse. There was no mechanism for refusal, but their reluctance was visible in every small gesture, the slow reach for a coat, the glance back into the warmth of a hallway, the silent calculation of whether this could be disputed. It could not. Patton's order was unprecedented, not because it was cruel, but because it was honest. It said, plainly, what most preferred to leave unspoken. It would be important to remember that later, that it was beautiful, that the sky was the particular pale blue of an early European spring, and that the beech trees lining the road had just begun to open, their leaves still small and bright. the kind of green that only exists for a few weeks before it deepens into summer. A woodpecker worked at something in the tree line. Light fell in long, clean angles across the path. For the first mile, some of the civilians talked. Not loudly, and not about anything of consequence, the kind of conversation people reach for when silence feels too revealing. A comment about the cold, a remark about the length of the walk, the small social machinery of educated people maintaining composure in uncomfortable circumstances. A few walked with their hands clasped behind their backs, a posture of leisure, as though they had chosen to be here. The soldiers did not talk. They walked at the column's edges with the measured pace of men who had learned not to waste energy, their rifles carried with a casualness that was not, in any meaningful sense, casual at all. When one civilian near the back began to slow, drifting toward the verge with the tentative intention of someone testing a boundary, a soldier moved alongside him without a word. The man returned to the column. No one tested it again. By the second mile, the conversation had thinned. The road began to climb, gently at first, then with more insistence, up through the wooded slopes of the Ettersberg Hill. The trees grew closer together here, the canopy denser, the light more broken. The air changed character in a way that was difficult to name immediately. Cooler, yes, but something else beneath that. Something that did not belong to spring mornings or woodland walks. A woman near the middle of the column raised a gloved hand briefly to her face. She lowered it without comment. By the third mile, the silence had become its own presence. Even those who had maintained their composure with the most determination began to lose the scaffolding of it. Eyes moved differently, no longer scanning the tree line with the detached interest of a morning stroll, but dropping to the road, fixing on the ground a few feet ahead, the posture of people bracing. Then the fence appeared through the trees, not all at once, in pieces, a post, a wire, another post. The geometry of enclosure revealing itself gradually, the way a sentence becomes clear before it is finished. Barbed wire caught the morning light. A watchtower stood at the perimeter, empty now, but built for a purpose that required no explanation. The smell arrived fully here, settled and unmistakable. Several people stopped walking. The soldiers did not stop. Keep moving. The gates did not need a sign. They communicated everything through structure alone. The heavy iron, the precise spacing of the barbed wire, the watchtowers positioned not to observe the surrounding forest, but to observe inward, to track movement within. This was not a place designed to keep people out. It was designed to keep people in. The distinction was architectural, and it registered somewhere beneath conscious thought before the mind had time to process it. The civilians passed through in silence. Nothing had been moved. That was Patton's order, and it had been followed with the same meticulous care that had once governed this place's darker operations. The camp existed exactly as the liberating soldiers had found it, not as an exhibit, not as a memorial, but as a fact. Raw, unmediated, and total. The personal effects came first. Piled against the walls of the processing buildings, shoes in quantities that defeated comprehension, stacked in heaps that reached chest height. Hundreds, thousands. Each one had been worn by a person, scuffed by their particular gait, shaped over time by the specific contours of a human foot. Beside them, clothing folded or bundled or simply discarded, a compressed archive of ordinary lives reduced to inventory, eyeglasses, leather belts, a child's single boot. Some civilians stopped walking and simply stared. Others continued moving as though momentum alone could carry them through without full comprehension taking hold. It did not work. The mind, confronted with evidence at this scale, cannot maintain selective vision for long. Then the bodies. They were stacked near the crematorium in arrangements that spoke not of chaos, but of system, a distinction that made it worse, somehow, than carnage would have been. These were not the casualties of battle. There was no violence here that could be attributed to the unpredictable brutality of combat. This was administered death, recorded and processed, the end product of a bureaucracy that had run without interruption for 8 years. The crematoriums stood intact, their doors open, the interior visible to anyone who looked. Some looked, some could not. A professor near the front of the group pressed a handkerchief to his mouth, not against the smell alone, but against something that had no practical remedy. A city official stood with his hands at his sides, perfectly still, in the posture of a man whose body had stopped receiving instructions. A woman wept without covering her face, tears running freely, making no sound. The soldiers stood at intervals and watched, not with judgment and not with satisfaction, with the particular stillness of men who had already spent several days inside their own version of this reckoning and had not yet found the far edge of it. No one spoke. The evidence required nothing added to it. It was complete, and it was everywhere, and there was no direction a person could look that offered relief from the knowledge of what this place had been. They came from between the buildings, slowly and in small groups, moving with the careful deliberateness of bodies that had learned to conserve everything, every step measured, every motion reduced to its minimum. Their clothes hung from them in the way that clothes hang from structures rather than people. Their faces carried something that was not quite expression, a quality of witness that had moved beyond ordinary emotion into something more permanent and more difficult to name. They were the living, what remained of them, and they walked directly toward the civilians. No soldier directed this. No officer had planned it as part of the morning's itinerary. It happened the way certain things happen, because it was, in some essential sense, inevitable. These two groups of people had lived 5 miles apart for 8 years. They had breathed the same valley air, existed beneath the same sky, belonged to the same geography. They had never, until this morning, been made to stand in the same place and look at each other. The civilians did not move. There was nowhere to move to. One survivor stopped in front of the group. He was a man of indeterminate age. The camp had made age difficult to read in the conventional way. He stood straight with a composure that cost him something visible. He looked at the faces arranged before him for a long moment before he spoke. When he did, his voice was level, not raised, not theatrical. The flatness of it was what made it unbearable. Did you see us? A pause. Did you hear us? Another. Did you care? No one answered. There was no answer available that the moment would have accepted. The professor with the handkerchief looked at the ground. The official who had stood so still now seemed to be holding himself together through pure mechanical effort. Several people were weeping openly. Others had the dry, fixed expression of individuals whose capacity for response had simply ceased to function, because the question had not been asked of soldiers or officers or administrators. It had been asked of neighbors, of the woman who bought bread on the same street, of the man whose children had attended the same school as a guard's children, of people who had closed windows against the smoke and told themselves it was something else, something explainable, something that did not require them to act. The accusation did not come with fury. It came with something harder, with clarity, with the terrible patience of a person who has had years to formulate the precise question that cannot be deflected, denied, or absorbed into the architecture of not knowing. It reached every person in that courtyard, and in the silence that followed, something shifted that could not be shifted back. The distance between Weimar and Buchenwald, always measured in miles, revealed itself at last for what it had always actually been. The order came through the soldiers with the same flat economy of language that had governed the entire morning. There were dead who required burial. There were civilians present who were capable of the work. The two facts were connected by a logic that required no elaboration. Shovels were distributed. For a moment, no one moved. The request existed, in a register so far outside the boundaries of ordinary experience that the civilians' minds seemed unable to root it into action. These were people for whom physical labor was largely theoretical. Professors who worked with language, officials who worked with paper, professionals whose relationship with their own hands had been largely decorative for decades. Then the soldiers waited, and the moment passed, and the shovels were taken. The ground at Buchenwald had already been broken in places, the beginning of work that the camp's liberators had started and could not finish alone. The civilians were directed to the edges of it. They moved in the careful, uncertain way of people hoping that the mechanics of the task might remain abstract for just a little longer. They did not. The dead were handled with the impersonal efficiency that the scale of the work demanded. But efficiency did nothing to insulate the hands from what they were touching, or the mind from what the hands reported back. These were not abstractions. They were not statistics from a document or figures in a report. They were people of specific weight and specific stillness, each one the end point of a specific sequence of deliberate cruelties. A man near the far end of the row stopped digging. He stood with both hands on the shovel's handle, his knuckles pale, staring at nothing in particular. A soldier spoke to him quietly. He resumed. A woman had to be guided away from the work entirely. She did not weep. She had moved past weeping into a silence so complete it seemed structural, as though sound itself had been removed from her vicinity. Others worked without stopping, with a focused, mechanical intensity that was its own form of response, the mind retreating into the simple grammar of physical motion because the alternative was to remain present in a place that presence could not survive intact. Where, that morning, they had walked with their hands clasped at their backs in the posture of genteel inconvenience, those same hands now worked in the earth of Buchenwald, returning to the ground what the camp had reduced to remains. The contrast did not need to be articulated. Every person present could feel it. The precise distance between who they had been at the city's edge that morning and who they were now, here, doing this. That distance had a name. It had always had a name. They were only now, with their hands in the earth, beginning to speak it. The walk back was 5 miles, the same as before. The road was unchanged. The beech trees still held their early green against the afternoon light. The sky had not darkened. The woodpecker, somewhere in the tree line, was still working at the same problem it had been working at that morning. The countryside offered no acknowledgement of what had occurred within it. It remained exactly what it had always been, indifferent and whole, which was its own particular cruelty. The civilians moved through it without speaking. Not the restrained quiet of the morning's procession, when silence had been a social posture, a way of managing an uncomfortable situation with the tools of refinement. This was a different order of silence altogether. It was the silence of people for whom language had temporarily lost its architecture, who reached, automatically, for words to process experience and found nothing load-bearing. The soldiers walked the same positions as before, flanking the column at its edges. But the enforcement was different now, or rather it was the same, and it no longer mattered. No one was drifting toward the verge. No one was calculating the possibility of turning back. There was nowhere to turn back to. The morning's version of themselves, the people who had set out along this road with their composure intact, and their denials freshly rehearsed, were not waiting for them in Weimar. Those people were gone. What replaced them was still being determined. Some would speak in the weeks and months that followed, haltingly at first, and then with the particular urgency of people who find that silence is no longer structurally possible, that what they had witnessed had weight that required distribution, and that carrying it alone was not survivable. They would speak to their families, to clergymen, to anyone who sat still long enough. Some of what they said would be recorded, some of it would be believed, others would not speak at all, would return to their houses, to their bookshelves and their concert programs and their careful routines, and would reconstruct around the day a silence so total that their own children would not know, decades later, that it had happened. The not knowing, which had once been a choice made in daylight, would become something else, a room in the house that no one opened, and some would spend the remainder of their lives in the space between those two positions, neither speaking nor fully silent, haunted by the specific geometry of it, 5 miles, and what that measurement now meant. Not a distance between a city and a camp, a distance between knowing and choosing not to know, between proximity and responsibility, between the smoke on a morning wind and the decision to close the window and say nothing. The soldiers understood what they had witnessed that afternoon, not the horror of the camp. They had carried that for days already. But this, what it looked like when an entire society was walked to the edge of its own reflection and made to look down. It looked like this road. It looked like this silence. It looked like people who had, until this morning, successfully lived alongside the unthinkable, and who were now condemned for the rest of their lives to know exactly what that said about them. The question Patton had answered with a march was not a question about 1945 or about Germany or about the particular machinery of one regime's atrocities. It was a question about the oldest human instinct of all, the instinct to look away, and what we become when we do. Military reports documented the march with the clinical precision of official accounting, dates, numbers, the names of units involved, the sequence of events. Allied photographers had moved through Buchenwald in the days following liberation, producing images that would eventually circulate in newspapers across the world. Survivor testimonies were gathered, catalogued, preserved. The evidence was extensive, and it was permanent, and it ensured that what had happened on that hillside could not, by any reasonable measure, be disputed. What the records could not fully capture was what it did to the people who walked back down. Some of Weimar's citizens left accounts of their own, in letters and diaries, and the occasional public statement that described the day with varying degrees of honesty. A few acknowledged, in language stripped of its usual refinement, that they had known more than they had admitted, that the trains had not been mysterious, that the smoke had not been ambiguous, that the silence they had maintained for 8 years had been a decision, however they had dressed it at the time. Others maintained to the end of their lives that they had been innocent of knowledge. The records do not support this, but the records could not reach inside the specific human mechanism that allows a person to live alongside horror and remain, in their own accounting, untouched by it. That mechanism is not unique to Weimar. That is the point Patton understood when he gave his order, and it is the reason that mourning has outlasted the war itself in the moral imagination of those who study it. Every generation produces its version of the 5-mile distance, the horror that operates just beyond the comfortable radius of ordinary life, the smoke on the wind that carries a smell no one names aloud, the trains that pass on a schedule everyone knows and no one discusses. The question is never whether such things exist, They have always existed. The question, Patton's question, the survivor's question, the question that hung in the silence of that return march, is what ordinary people, educated people, civilized people, choose to do with what they already know. Buchenwald was liberated. The camp was documented, tried, committed to the historical record with a thoroughness that ensures it cannot be erased. But the civilians of Weimar carried something home with them that no record could contain: the specific, private knowledge of what they had been before that morning and what they became before it ended. The distance between those two things was not 5 miles. It was not measurable in any unit that geography provides. Some of them never spoke of it again. Some could speak of nothing else. Both responses were, in their own way, an answer to the same question. The question is still open. It has always been open. It is open now.